Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I am your host, Doug Stuart, and I am pleased to have a very special guest on with us. His name is Nick Gillespie. If you're a libertarian for more than 5 minutes, you probably know exactly who he is, but he is, if you've been a libertarian if you're not a libertarian or you need to know who he is, he's an editor-at-large at Reason. He's co-author of a book called The Declaration of Independence, How Libertarian Politics Can Fix What's Wrong with America. He's host of the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie, and he's been part of the libertarian movement for decades. And I wanted to have him on here to discuss his personal journey, his views, and how he sees the direction of the libertarian movement, and then explain his baffling amount of encyclopedic knowledge on pop culture, because that's actually more important than I think a lot of people realize. Nick, I really appreciate you coming on and have this conversation.
Oh, it's a real pleasure, Doug. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for what you guys are doing at LCI. It's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, thank you. You've been a promoter of ours from time to time through X, through Freedom Fest. You actually moderated an important discussion we had in Memphis a few years ago. So you've been a little bit of a part of helping us get our message out there. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I wanted to start a little bit on a personal note because, over the years, I've listened to you talk about, all kinds of things, whether it's the Reason Roundtable that you're on or whether it's just you talking with a guest on your own show or just interviews you've been on, that when the topic of immigration comes up, you get a little irritated with the anti-immigration sentiment. And of course, that's pretty rampant right now. Libertarians are even somewhat susceptible to this from time to time. And I have a sense that given what seems to me a pretty emotional reaction to it, it's not just about the right libertarian position. There's something more important to that. And my guess is it has to do with you coming from a family of immigrants. So I think I wanted to start off with just getting a sense of your personal history and why that particularly gets you fired up.
Yeah, it is interesting, and from a psychological position perspective, when you start talking about something and you get choked up or angry or happy for no clear reason, like, it's channeling something. All four of my grandparents were, and immigration is certainly that for me, all four of my grandparents were immigrants. My father's parents were from Ireland and my mother's parents were from Italy. And they all showed up in America, like in and around New York City in the 19-teens. And that has, that's a big part of who I am and the way that I think about myself, partly because they were all coming here for, more opportunities. They weren't quite political refugees or asylees, although there was weird stuff going on both in southern Italy as well as Ireland. At that time period, and also World War I was looming and all of that kind of stuff. But for me, immigration has just, it may be more important than freedom of speech in a lot of ways, freedom of mobility. I think if you believe in kind of libertarian values of autonomy and self-ownership and the ability to create the world that you want to live in, being able to migrate freely is pretty important there. I also, on top of that, I'm a big believer in kind of cultural mongrelization and hybridization. And I think that, the societies and the groups and the movements that do best are ones that are constantly bringing in new people with new experiences, new voices, new ways of being. So for me, immigration and migration are just really important. On a personal level, I was born in Brooklyn in 1963. I grew up in New Jersey. I've lived all over the country, and I tracked at some point. I'd moved like more than 8,000 miles for a combination of school and work all around the country. I ended up back in New York. I moved back here in 2018. But that kind of freedom of movement, really, which is what I think immigration is about, is really important to me. And I see certainly over the past decade, a real anxiety about new types of people coming here, people who couldn't possibly assimilate, people who will never be American, et cetera. I see like an intensified anxiety over that. Oftentimes, outright racist claims against people, or just a belief that we have too many people here already and we have to keep it out, where we only can leave people in. And that deeply worries me and offends me. I have a doctorate in American literature, and I wrote about, among other things, about nativist tropes in American literature in the 19-teens and 20s, particularly in a book like The Great Gatsby, which I think is a phenomenal text that still explains a lot of what's going on in America. And rumbling around there in the background of that book is this fear that America is being overrun or being swamped by lower orders, whether it's blacks migrating from the South into New York or Italians and Greeks kind of muscling in, and Jews especially as well, muscling into New York and kind of destroying this great place. So this is a cyclical fear in American history, and it's one that leads to the end or the diminution of a lot of basic freedoms, that I think any libertarian should be worried about.
Yeah.
If I may, just also to put it out there, because I oftentimes get accused of being like, well, I'm an open borders guy. Like, I don't believe that borders should exist or should matter. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking was something that Chase Oliver, the Libertarian Party candidate for the president in 2024, talked about. What we should do is return to something like the Ellis Island model that was in place from about 1880 to about 1925 on the East Coast, where you show up, and if you are healthy and you don't have any clear physical or mental illness or criminal record, you come in, and you don't get handouts, you don't get welfare, you don't get that, but you're allowed to make a go of it here in America. And I think that's what I'm talking about. The southern border under Biden, and to some degree under Trump before him, as well as Obama and George Bush, was a mess. Like, we need to have more orderly legal immigration, and that gets rid of illegal immigration, which brings a lot of other problems that have nothing to do with immigration any more than alcohol trade does not lead to organized crime except when we're prohibiting it.
Right.
If we made it easier for more people to move here legally, the country would be richer. It would be more interesting. We would just everything would be better. Literally.
Yeah. I would agree with you. And after Dave Smith and Alex Narasta's debate, I had Alex on to talk about this. And one thing that we discussed was the position that you just described, which is that sort of Ellis Island system, turns off some libertarians in a way, because it's like, well, see, you're admitting that the government ought to control it. And I kind of point out, what? That's not really here's what we would like. It is a rhetorical way of saying, back then, we now in the future know that back then that didn't harm America by now, right? And so it's a way of sort of shifting the Overton window, I suppose, in a way that says, okay, this is actually something that worked for America. You can see that the results were not disastrous despite all the nativism that was run rampant. And so there's this rhetorical idea that you're moving somebody's not idea, but like way of thinking along, even if they're not, necessarily going to buy in. Because I know that, Chase Oliver and Alex Narasta, both you and I would also say, hey, that would be better than simply what we have today.
Well, and then the alternative is always like, oh, well, you're saying the government should regulate it, so I'm against that because I'm a libertarian. But I think that the government should round up and deport all illegal immigrants, right? Like, so
right.
What are you complaining about? What are you talking about? The other thing that comes up a lot is that people will say, back in the 19-teens, we didn't have the welfare state we have now. And until we get rid of the welfare state, we can't have, more robust immigration. And it's kind of like, particularly from a libertarian perspective, you're saying I'm choosing the welfare state over the free movement of people. I like to say, we should build a wall around the welfare state, not around the United States.
Yeah.
People like Alex and others can show that immigrants, legal or illegal, but especially illegal, consume fewer public goods than native-born people. And in net, virtually every economist, even ones who do not like large-scale immigration, will admit that immigration on balance adds to the economy. It lifts all boats.
Even the ones who have found negative impacts, they even admit they're negative. They're negligible.
Right. Yeah. So, and again, immigrants are always, and this is not just true in America. I mean, this is true in the Bible. It is true, throughout human history, like newcomers or strangers in strange lands are blamed for everything that goes bad, according to the people who are complaining about them. And, the fact of the matter is that like immigrants are, they're not bringing disease, they're not bringing crime, they're not bringing drugs. And, to the extent that any of that is true, it's kind of like, well, if to the extent that we import drugs from outside of America, it's because Americans want drugs. And like, then you're not going to solve that problem by, blocking people who are, crossing the border, looking to work, and to better their lives and the lives of their children and other people. So,
yeah. How did your views growing up as a Roman Catholic influence some of your views on even immigration or just anything? How was that influence?
It's interesting. I was raised Catholic, and I think a lot about this. I have an abiding interest in religion, not as a believer really, but as somebody who understands how religion functions for individuals to build community and identity and to have a sense of just like meaning in the world. And I find my parents, because they were both from Catholic families, and they were poor they were both born in the 1920s. They grew up in poor immigrant ghettos in New York City and in Waterbury, Connecticut. My mother, as a matter of fact, didn't speak English until she went to grammar school. And her parents never learned English. And her parents, who again showed up here around, in the mid 1910s and died in the late 70s, early 80s, lived their entire lives in a world where they could get by every day doing, business and going shopping, only speaking Italian. But the Catholic angle, which is something I didn't fully appreciate until years later, being Catholic was both, that was one of the reasons why they were considered not American and like worthy of being marginalized. And, being Catholic, Catholics now, any Catholic who complains about prejudice against Catholics is just full of shit. And then even William F. Buckley, who turns 100 this year, and there's been a lot of, stuff about him. There's a new biography. Well into the 80s, he would keep saying, the last acceptable prejudice was prejudice against Catholics. And it's simply not true. Catholics are the single largest religious denomination in the country. And they, I mean, there are, is it a majority of Supreme Court justices are Catholic, or it's pretty close to it? It's like Catholics run everything, like it doesn't matter. And it's also not a predictor.
Letting them in wasn't a problem for America. Yeah, I mean, I guess depending on where you sit, maybe it was.
Yeah, I mean, they did help destroy the WASP, ascendancy, but that was dying anyway for other reasons. Yeah. Mostly because WASP wanted to marry Catholics. It's like, oh, these are like new, interesting people with better food, or something. But the function of Catholicism, I think, for my parents when they were younger, and then the town, I grew up in Middletown, New Jersey, which is about 50 miles outside of New York, and everybody I met there pretty much was Catholic. And I went to Catholic grammar school and Catholic high school, and it formed. It was a serious source of identity and kind of power, in the sense of like, okay, you were part of a community, so you had support, you had protection, you had a history and a kind of, way of thinking about stuff. And that was very important. And it was interesting. My parents, who, again, my father was an altar boy, doing the Latin Mass and all of this kind of stuff. At a certain point, they were probably in their 50s, I guess. They stopped going to church, and like the Catholic Church no longer structured their lives. Like, I mean, all of our social life, so much, our education was funneled through that, et cetera. And I found that kind of interesting. But like, when I tell this weird story. One time, my family, we were watching Gone with the Wind was on TV. And, so like Gone with the Wind is it's about a lot of really big things. Some of it, in a way, it is a grotesque version of America. It is a grotesque version of American history, et cetera. But my parents' takeaway from Gone with the Wind, there's a scene where Scarlett O'Hara is at Tara, and somebody's sick, and a priest comes and says mass because her father might be dying or died, and and the O'Haras were Catholic, and my parents were like, "Hey, look at that! They're Catholic." Like that was like their big thing was like, "Look at that! That's cool."
My parents would point out when they saw that like NFL athletes were Christians, they'd be pointing out, "Oh, he's a strong Christian."
Yeah,
and I get that. Yeah,
do this with everybody, and Italians do it. Like it's ended now, but in an era when people like Dean Martin or like major entertainers would hide their Italian name with some kind of like more Anglo name. You point out with pride, but so that's how Catholicism in a lot of ways was important to me growing up. It kind of gave me an alternative history of the United States, or an alternative way of being, which I think we may have talked about this in various contexts, but it also meant because there was anti-Catholic prejudice written into all of the early laws of the colonies and the states of America, with the exception of like Maryland and Georgia. We were taught in Catholic school, weirdly, like everything, what America was a place of religious freedom and tolerance. And so every year I would learn about Roger Williams, Thomas Hooker, the founder of Connecticut, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her name now, Anne Hutchinson, the great religious dissenter from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And that set me on a track towards libertarianism in a weird way. And the Catholic Church is not particularly libertarian or anything, but that focus on the idea that people should be free to come here first and then to practice religion or live their lives the way they want to. And so inadvertently, that was, growing up Catholic, I think was a major contributor to why I became a libertarian. And every year we had terrible history classes. Like we would always start at, the beginning of American history of like European contact. And then we would get to maybe the Revolutionary War, maybe, 1800. And then we would start over the next year. We never like picked up where we left off. So it was just this iteration. It seems like, for a dozen years, like, what was really great, people like Roger Williams, Anne Hutchinson, and Thomas Hooker, because they believed in religious freedom. And that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So you obviously aren't Roman Catholic anymore, and you are a libertarian. It sounds like the way you're describing your Catholic upbringing, it sort of paved the way to be more about free movement, free people, free practice of religion. How did that?
Also, I should add, that the Catholic Church, again, and the Catholic Church contains multitudes, right?
Sure.
And it's depending on the country you're in, it functions in different ways. In the U.S., I think it was mostly, a force for things like more immigration. And, during the 80s or 70s and 80s, the role of the Catholic Church in like bringing in Vietnamese boat people, because South Vietnam was a Catholic country or had a large Catholic population. You saw this opening up of communities. A friend of mine who grew up Catholic in Dodge City, Kansas, there's a little Saigon in Dodge City, Kansas, which has tremendous Vietnamese food because all of the Catholic churches there were like, send us as many Vietnamese people as you can. And that was a model of Christian charity and Catholic charity and openness, I think, which has also really stuck with me specifically regarding immigration.
Yeah. So did libertarianism find you, or were you looking for it as when was that in your journey?
Yeah, that's it's an interesting question, and I would say it's a mix of things. To some part of me believes that libertarians are kind of born, or you're born with a predisposition towards individualism, and kind of the idea that like, okay, if I should be allowed to live how I want, and that also implies letting other people live the way they want, right? Not always, but hopefully it does. And I think that emphasis on on kind of toleration. That was weirdly, because, the Catholic Church in Europe is certainly not a tolerant, or was not historically a tolerant institution, right?
You don't say.
But it's so fascinating to me, again, about religion, because like the Catholic Church in Latin America is very different than the Catholic Church in, Central Europe under communism. And it's it performs different types of function in the same way that a kind of evangelical or independent Protestantism obviously functions differently, both for its adherents as well as in the world, than kind of mainline Protestant denomination, right? And that, and then like if, in Italy, being Catholic means something very different than being Catholic in England, right? Where it's like at a persecuted minority or a suspect minority. And so in any case, growing up Catholic in the context that I did, that opened me up to the idea of kind of toleration. And then it's like, what are the frameworks for that? And, the real framework, which I wish America had paid more attention to when it was being developed, and I wish we would pay more attention to it now, really, for me, comes from Roger Williams, the founder of Providence, Rhode Island, and the person who got the charter for Rhode Island, and was, wrote the first tract in the English language for fully secular government, where, from what I understand, and I read a lot about him, I mean, he believed that the Pope was the Antichrist or a werewolf, and all of the Puritan kind of prejudices of the day or beliefs of the day, but he still insisted that religion and politics should be separate spheres, because politics will just, will taint and poison religion. And, history obviously, I think, proves him right. And so, what he called for in The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, this phenomenal 17th century tract, was, a complete separation of that and the idea that, getting rid of establishment clauses for anything. And it's just like, you should be allowed to worship freely and then live freely as long as you're not impinging on other people and treating people equally. His relationships with the Indians around him are also, phenomenal. And, weirdly, so, this is just a weird way of saying that from a Catholic schooling, I ended up becoming like, the world's biggest Roger Williams fanboy. And he is a proto-libertarian, I think, in that he has very deeply held personal beliefs that he wants to be free to develop and live within. But he also recognizes, like, we need liberal tolerance and pluralism in order to succeed as a society, really. And so that was rumbling around in the back. And then the other thing about the Catholic education stuff is that, like, I learned an alternative history of the United States, which was all about how, there were these groups that were not really fully appreciated, but were doing all sorts of work. Because to this point, like we always learned about Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration, an absolutely minor player. He's from Maryland. His brother, John Carroll, was the founder of Georgetown and was like either the first bishop or archbishop in like colonial England, America, or, English Anglo-America colonies. But like you key in on all this weird stuff going on. And I think there's something that predisposes one towards libertarianism when you start to realize, like, the official mainstream received story glosses over a lot of weird and interesting kind of things that are going on below the surface, or that don't get official attention. And then, the big, and so I like that, and I would turn that against my Catholic, school teachers when they would talk about something, and I'd be like, well, what about this weird revolt or this subculture that was doing all kinds of interesting stuff, and they weren't harming anybody, and, the state or the church would try and like wipe them out. And then, but really when I was in high school, I have an older brother who went to college, and he started reading Reason magazine and introduced me to it. And I was like, oh, this is really cool. Like, I liked what Reason was, writing about and the way they were doing it. And I started thinking of myself as a libertarian, a small L libertarian, not particularly political. I believed in things like free speech and, immigration or freedom of movement, and the right to run your business the way you want to and things like that. But those things primed me. And then it was really when I went to, by the time I got to college, I would say, if somebody said, are you conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat, I would say I'm libertarian. And then when I eventually went to grad school for English lit and American lit and cultural studies in the late 80s, that it became more pronounced because this was a period of, well, what was called political correctness, which kind of the political correct period in the late 80s through the mid 90s trained the professors who are now presiding over kind of woke universities. And realized I was not a left winger. And there was a small cadre of kind of hyper conservative people who were conservative aesthetically, but also socially. And I wasn't that. And so being libertarian became more important to me really in early adulthood.
In the 80s, was that sort of environment? I would imagine it's like fairly Marxist in sort of the ideology of the professor.
What's fascinating, and I've got an interview up with a guy named Mark Pennington, who's a British academic who just wrote a book about Michel Foucault, who, a left-wing French theorist who was the most influential kind of social writer in the social sciences and the humanities of the last half of the 20th century, about how Foucault and Friedrich Hayek are really very similar and intertwined in interesting ways. And I totally believe that. And I was pushing that line when I was in grad school with, very little impact. But what I was going to say is the people I met in academia were not Marxists. Marxists were and always have been a very small subset of people on the left in academia. And most people on the left in academia are not as systematic as Marxists. And they do not, it's much more about things like identity politics or kind of consensus politics. Marxists are radicals in similar ways to libertarians, and I ended up hanging out a lot more with the actual Marxists than with mere leftists because they were not, their commitments were weird and, just kind of inconstant. Like they would, they would vote for Bill Clinton. That type of thing, like as opposed to Marxists were like, no, Bill Clinton is terrible. Like we need a radical reformation of society. And like, while I disagree with, most of their methods of analysis and certainly most of their goals, like I could have a better conversation with those people.
Okay. Yeah. All right. I see.
And I will say that, I'm sorry to yammer.
No, you're good.
I haven't talked about this stuff in a long time, but the election, I was in grad school for the election of 1988. And this is one of, like, it's a big moment, I think, where, there had been 8 years of Ronald Reagan. And like, you cannot underestimate how, how Trump won. And people are like, how could Trump win? I don't know anybody who voted for him. When Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter in 1980, and then things went bad for a couple of years. But then when he beat Walter Mondale in 1984, and everything seemed to be going well, like the economy was growing, like Americans were optimistic again. Academics felt like they were in internal exile. It was really like the aliens from the old show V, if you remember that at all. Like, it was a bunch of aliens who take over the planet. And they felt like they were in an occupied country. And they knew when, Reagan was like a black swan. He was, charismatic and a good communicator. George H.W. Bush was, paper mache Mephistopheles. He had no, he had no charisma. He had no anything going on. He would be defeated by the great Mike Dukakis, right? The Colossus of Massachusetts, who bestrode the world like a god. And when George H.W. Bush won and won easily over Mike Dukakis, people in academia freaked out because they were like, oh my God, like this, it's not going back to
we're done.
Left-wing country. And they flipped out. And I think that's when a lot of people in academia were like, oh, we have to become really politically motivated and activated because otherwise we're going to, we're going to be like in Stalin's Russia, even if they were like, oh, well, Stalin's Russia really wasn't that bad when you think about it.
Yeah. So, well, that was also the time of the rise of the beginning of the critical theorists too. And who were basically, they did latch on to the whole, like the point of Marxist analysis is to change the world, not just understand it.
That's right.
And so did those coincide in your mind too?
Yeah, and what is interesting though is that Marxist analysis ultimately is about class and the position of, like, it's about economic classes that dictate a political and cultural superstructure. The critical theorists in general, but then especially the ones who emerged in the late 80s and are still around today, it's much more about identity and it's about race. Everybody would say, we're going to look at things from the perspectives of race, class, and gender, but they never cared about class. And it was always about race and ethnicity, and then gender, which morphed from a kind of feminist analysis to a much broader kind of set of identities that had to do with sexual orientation more than gender per se. And as a result, they ended up being at odds in many ways with the Marxists, because the Marxists were like, no, it's economics is everything and it's class position. And then these other people were like, no, it's not.
Do you think that's why they ignored the class component of that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they became oppositional. Because it seems that's very oddly missing in some of the policies prescriptions that identity politics typically do. It's it's all about look at the outcomes of black people. It must be evidence of systemic racism. But it's well, hang on, you're not doing a class analysis. You'd probably have something to balance that with.
I think Bernie Sanders is interesting in this sense of Bernie was a class warrior until when he started running for president, especially the second time, with the rise of identity politics. In 2016, he was still talking mostly about class and about, we have to help people, poor people and lower income people. And again, most of his prescriptions are terrible and would actually hurt poor people and lower income people, but he was focused on class. In the 2020 race, there's a moment, I think it was in Seattle, where he almost literally gets pushed off the stage by a couple of Black Lives Matter activists. And when he emerges a couple weeks later, he is talking about identity politics. He has given up class. And I think, that's telling. And that was kind of the last gasp of a class-based politics. And I think, from a libertarian perspective, you can do meaningful class politics in terms of if you believe, and I certainly lean this way, the reason why I am a capitalist or why I think capitalism is good is because it gives more opportunities to people like me. I grew up lower middle class. My father didn't even graduate high school. I was the first generation of my family to go to college. And I think a capitalist society loosens things up more and allows for more mobility or individualization of who you end up being. That's why I am in many ways a libertarian, because from a class analysis level, I think it gives more opportunity for more people to move up and out of wherever they're from. Class is something nobody, it's never been a popular means of, politics or identity, because the thing with class is when you move from being lower class or lower middle class to upper class, you are ashamed of where you come from. And you're ashamed in a way that, it's just hard to glamorize, bad taste, especially in the academy. And that's what I saw again and again, where it's if you're raised upper middle class with upper middle class preferences and aesthetics and things like that, you can't look at people from, Appalachian, Ohio, or Kentucky, or, white, lower class white ethnics, white trash. It's very hard for people, regardless of racial and ethnic or gender identity, to romanticize those people if they didn't come from that. And if you come from it, you're kind of I don't want to dwell on that too much. J.D. Vance strikes me as an interesting figure in this.
Yeah, okay. Hey everyone, it's Doug from LCI. As you may know, the team at Podsworth Media has worked with us for a long time, producing our content for most of the Christians for Liberty network. A big part of that over the past couple of years has been using the Podsworth app to make our audio sound clean, level, and professional, even when the raw recordings were super sketchy, like this one you're listening to right now. Believe it or not, this recording was that bad before I ran it through the Podsworth app, and you can hear the full before and after demo yourself at podsworth.com. The app recently got a huge update, and it's now better than ever. So good, in fact, that it can take almost any atrocious voice recording and make it sound great. Here's how it works. It removes background noise, cuts down on plosives, fixes clipping when your gain is too high, removes clicks and pops, reduces reverb, improves tone, and levels out the dialogue so that you don't get any crazy volume jumps. Everybody hates that in a podcast. Using it is super simple. You just go to podsworth.com and click Get Started, drag and drop the audio files, open them right up from your phone's browser, customize your settings however you want, but honestly, the default works great for most settings. And here's a really cool thing. If you enter code LCI50, you'll get 50% off your first order. No account needed, just your email and payment. You'll get a download link in your inbox with cleaned up files. It's perfect for podcasts, YouTube videos, sermons, audiobooks, you name it. If your recording sounds rough, the Podsworth app can make it not only sound listenable, but professional. And remember, when you use code LCI50, you get half off your first order, and you'll also be supporting the work here at LCI. So I want to talk a little bit about libertarian philosophy and postmodernism, because you're one of the few people, and I know the day we're recording this is the day after you released that interview with, was it Mark Pennington?
Yes.
Yeah, which I listened to, and I just thought it was really appropriate to listen to the day before we're having this conversation.
Yeah, well,
although I went to buy his book and then realized I had to also feed my family. So,
oh yeah, it's an academic book.
Yeah,
but it's like $90 or something.
Yeah, I was like, okay, maybe later.
He's done a lot of interviews, like ChatGPT it or something like that.
Yeah, okay, I'll do that for sure. But I do recommend checking it out. It was an exciting interview to listen to. You've been pretty open and positive in, anything I've heard you talk about the term, what you're using the word postmodern libertarianism. Yeah. What do you mean by that? Because I know a lot of libertarians might see that as an oxymoron.
Oh yeah, or if you're broadly on the right, however you define that, the one thing for sure is that postmodernism is terrible, and
it's as bad as communism.
Marxist, it's a Marxist leftist homosexual plot or something, right? So here and
throw in pedophile, and you've got all of the every ingredient they think that exists. Yeah, and maybe among the edgier Christians or Protestants, it's also kind of Catholic, right? I don't know. You know what? It's funny. I know you're joking, but my personal introduction to understanding postmodernism from a more broadly Christian perspective that's not negative was from a Roman Catholic.
Yeah, and it's funny because the Catholic Church is actually not a postmodern institution, and let me explain it. It's very hierarchical and it's totalist. Like, it will tell you how to live every aspect of your life, because not from divine revelation, but from the institution of the church as it's built up, over 2,000 years or whatever they claim. Postmodernism for me, or to be postmodern, is to have incredulity toward meta-narrative. This is a phrase that a French philosopher named Jean Lyotard talked about in a book called The Postmodern Condition that came out in the late 70s. And basically what incredulity toward meta-narrative means simply is like a radical skepticism towards truth claims, particularly of stories or of systems of knowledge that seek to explain everything in all of its particulars. So here is something that I think libertarians, rightly, when they hear something is totalitarian or totalist, they get a little bit antsy. Like how can any one thing explain everything, every jot and tittle, every little detail, every burp and fart and moan in human existence, right? No. And the big theories in the Enlightenment, kind of in the Enlightenment tradition, coming out of the 19th century, the big three theories that seek to do that are Marx, Freud, and Darwin. So genetics, you can explain everything through evolution and genetics, or through economics, or through psychology. And to be postmodern is to say, I don't know. That sounds like you're doing a little bit too much work. And ironically, and I talk about this with Pennington in this, the first Hayek book that I read was a book called The Counter-Revolution of Science, Studies on the Abuse of Reason. And it is it's pretty impenetrable in a lot of ways. It's from 1952 or so. And it is a study of how French and German Enlightenment thinkers said, okay, you know what, we've discovered how biology works and how physics works and how chemistry works. We understand the natural sciences. And just as those things are governed by laws, so too must human society. be governed by similar axiomatic laws where, every action has a counteraction, and all of this kind of stuff. Like, so we can figure out the laws of human societies and then use those to speed up or slow down or redirect where we want society and civilization to go. And Hayek, I think, pretty convincingly says, if that is what, if that's the Enlightenment, that leads to things like the Gulag. It leads to things like hyper-planned economies. It leads to treating individuals not as ends, not as means to an end, not as ends in themselves, but as means to an end. And the end is this grand plan, and it might be religious people, it might be economic people, it might be political people who say, you know what, like, our society is this, and we're driving towards this goal. And you either become part of the program, or you're part of the problem, and we're going to get rid of you. We're going to say you're insane. We're going to put you in prison. We're going to kill you. We're going to spend a lot of time converting you so that you think the way you have right think, so that you're doing the work we want you to do. And, to me, Hayek, this is really before I encountered postmodernism in an academic context. And I was like, wow, like Hayek, I buy this. And that's, liberalism as opposed to kind of socialism. And Hayek talks about this also in, in various books. But liberalism is not seeking to explain everything and to force people to live one particular way. It is a structure, a political and social structure that facilitates people being left alone and kind of figuring out things. And as long as you're not going to crash the whole system, you should be allowed to live how you want, to the greatest degree possible. So in a way, what postmodernism is then, to me, it stresses the limits of human knowledge rather than the extent. And it takes an attitude of humility rather than hubris towards policy and planning and telling people how they must live,
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're bringing up the Hayek quote that is often used about economics, about, what is it? The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they know about what they imagine they can design. And that encapsulates the whole, I guess maybe a postmodern ethos toward a totalizing state, somebody justifying, well, the state has to do this because X, Y, Z. And it's like, well, no, here's some economics that are based in are rule, maybe not rules based, but they have an order to them that we're not going to
emerges rather than is enforced. Like it emerges bottom up rather than enforced from top down.
Right.
And I think and it was interesting. And then I actually, in graduate school, I encountered Foucault, and I was like, God, this guy sounds a lot like Hayek, where he's talking about the ways in which top-down structures and, get imposed on people, or systems of knowledge turn into systems of power, where it's like, at various points, people say, well, this is sanity and this is insanity. And we're going to define that scientifically, which really is mere, preference in a lot of cases. And then we're going to take people we deem insane or impure or whatever, and we're going to put them in total institutions where we either torture them until they say the things we want them to say, or we keep them out of mind, et cetera. And I think it's a very fruitful conversation.
Or we exterminate them.
Yeah. Ultimately, that's and it, this is also, I think, people like Hayek and Foucault certainly, and all of us, really, in the wake of not just of the Holocaust, which was, the mechanized systematic approach, like using kind of techniques of mechanical and industrial production to exterminate people. In the Soviet Union, you had the same kind of attempt to rationalize all aspects of society and use scientific methods of management, and mind control and things like that in order to create a particular world. And, and they failed. I mean, they're morally repugnant, but they're, in the case of the Soviet Union, it also did not work. And we would do well to understand that, and then to look at the places where, in contemporary America, and it's, it's nothing like these things, but where people are trying to assert more and more control over other people on the grounds that like they are misguided or they're doing the wrong thing, and then we need to, sanction them. We need to re-educate them. We need to move them out of society or, kill them. I mean, these are all, to me, this is all like what libertarianism in a lot of ways is about.
There's a growing trend right now to be sort of anti-liberal. I think was it? I forget his name. He's one. He wrote after Why Liberalism Failed. Patrick Deneen.
Yeah.
You have, I think is it John Gray?
Is Deneen at? Is he at Notre Dame or one of them?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah,
viciously Catholic institution.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And this is true that the Catholic Church was not a fan of liberalism in the 19th century as liberalism started to kind of dominate things. The idea of limited government and the separation of church and state, and kind of free markets. They hated socialism. And this is not to paint with too broad a brush, but like the Catholic Church is not a liberal institution. It can live within liberal societies, but it's like, no, it's our way or the highway. So I can see why certain types of Catholic thinkers, not all of them, and there are so many Catholics, including Hayek, I believe, who was raised Catholic, or kind of was Catholic, but that really push liberalism as a governing philosophy. But like, you can understand why certain types of Catholic thinkers would love to get to a world post-liberalism, because it would free them up to start dictating morality in all of society, as opposed to using suasion. They can start using coercion and things like that.
Yeah. You and I often have the same reaction when we hear, because I've heard you react to this on interviews, have the same reaction to people who say that a postmodernity and modern capitalism has robbed us of meaning. And I've been recently watching the show Mad Men, and in one of the characters was reading a book by Barry Schwartz, and he actually quotes the book. He says, as the number of choices grows further, the negative escalates until we become overloaded. At this point, choice no longer liberates, but debilitates. It might even be said to tyrannize. And I just thought, no, it doesn't have to be that way. It's okay to have 45 types of deodorant on the shelf, Barry.
Absolutely, yeah. And also, I think about it. It's because Barry Sanders. I wish Barry Sanders was Bernie Sanders. We would be in a. The
I just realized what I did there. Sorry.
Yeah.
I meant to say Bernie Sanders, and I'm reading just anyway. Yeah.
But Barry Sanders is the real deal. A fascinating figure, and I wish he was in national politics, to say the least. But the way I see it is that modernity, or this proliferation of choices and options, is terrifying in a lot of ways, because it means like, God, every day you have to reset the defaults on a lot of stuff. It's like as if you went into Windows every day and you had, or, some kind of, some kind of computer system, I don't know, or your car presets, and every day you have to reset them because you have so many options. Like, you can look at that as wearying, or you can look at it as liberating. And, Bernie Sanders did say at one point, what sense does it make to talk about like 45 flavors of deodorant and different types of toothpaste and shoes while kids are going hungry, as if these two things are in any way related. And like, the fact of the matter is, as many few people in the globe are hungry now because there is more capitalism and free enterprise around the globe. But it's like, I don't know, like, ask somebody, like, if you are not, heterosexual, like, does having more options of sexuality, is that liberating, or is that like, oh, I can't make sense of the world anymore, I have too many choices? I hear you. Because it's like, and the fact is that we come up with ways to kind of make choices and live with them for a while, so we're not resetting every dial on our Windows, or every toggle switch on our Windows system every day. We're comfortable with that. We use shorthands and heuristics, but it's great to have these options so that you can be like, what, I want to try something very different. Or, this flavor of Axe body spray speaks to me. And it's like, it's good to have the 45th Axe body spray flavor. You know,
I think the sophisticated version of that argument, to give a little bit of deference there, is that the market has done something to the makers, the company Johnson and Johnson or whoever makes deodorants. The incentive to hire scientists to make more flavors of deodorant to help their bottom line, as opposed to those scientists being incentivized to help world hunger. I mean, that would be the Bernie Sanders probably sophisticated argument if he could make it.
The problem with that is just that we have fewer hungry people now than we did when we didn't even have deodorant. So, it's like these things are really delinked. But then,
you're saying that more deodorant, just to be clear, you're saying that the fact that we have more deodorant means more people are not going hungry.
Yeah, right, exactly. And they smell better too,
I don't think they're the same.
Yeah.
Sorry. Anyway.
No, but the other way of thinking about this, and I think about this a lot in a religious context, like, because it's you can look at the banality of consumer products, or like it is kind of nuts. So like, how many types of nut butter do you need? How many types of coffee? All of this kind of stuff. And it's like, I like it, but I can understand people being like, you know what, we don't need, all of these flavors of ice, plus gelato, plus sorbet, et cetera. But when it comes to things like religion, like, do you want to say, what the problem with Protestantism is, or the problem with Christianity? Because it's like, you've got the Orthodox Church and like an endless, procession of like subdivisions of that. There's a lot of different types of Catholic, both acknowledged and unacknowledged, and then Protestants, and then all of the other groups that may or may not really be part of the Protestant tradition. And it's like, oh, it's just too much. It's driving people crazy. And it's like, no, it is a reflection of free people being able to invent themselves and discover what is true for them, or what is meaningful for them and pleasurable for them. And the only bound, I think, that should be put on that, and in this, it's not as clear cut as it might sound, but like, are you actively harming other people who have rights that are equal to you?
Right.
To yours?
Yeah.
Like, there are limits in a liberal society. You cannot be fully tolerant of intolerance or of totalitarianism or something. But like, there's so much room for choice and evolution and experimentation.
Yeah.
And to me, like, and I see this in my own lifetime, to go in almost every area of activity, you go from having a couple of options, if any, to lots and lots. And I don't know, like, I come from peasant stock. I mean, I can only trace my family back to my grandparents, but I know that where they came from, they were peasants, they were serfs. They were the people who were expendable and had no agency, or very little agency. And it's like, I'm kind of digging this, and I want my kids to have more agency. And it does, the one thing I will say is that, like, we need to make this pivot, not only to embrace it, but then to build up the kind of institutions and education and kind of mindsets that allow people to flourish in this kind of world. Because you need different, you need to be able to handle choice. You need to be able to facilitate self-directed, kind of exploration of options and things like that. And then also, to go back to the actual Barry Schwartz, the Swarthmore psychologist who wrote the book, The Paradox of Choice, you need to learn how to satisfy. He talks about like where you make choices and then you're not constantly rethinking them and doubting them, but like, you make a choice and live with it, and you can revisit it later, but like, you're not paralyzed by choice, which I think, actually most people are very capable of making provisional contingent choices and then reevaluating them a little down the road.
Yeah. What do you think of the current state of the liberty movement as it is now? I mean, we're a few years past a Libertarian Party reset or, reconfiguration. We've had, it's been around for decades. You've been part of the movement for a while. Your description of why you're a libertarian and some of the things that appeals to you is but one of the many ways that libertarians tend to communicate that, some better than others. Where do you think that, what is the state of this and direction you think this might be going?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the state of the libertarian movement is pretty fractured and fractious. And I think that reflects a broader problem with politics and kind of, I tend to think of libertarian with a small l as a social movement or a cultural movement more than a political movement per se. But, whether you're talking about conservatives or progressives or liberals or libertarians, like there's all of them are confused right now, and all of them have been broken up. And, it would be it would be saying too much to say that Donald Trump is the guy who came in and like broke everything. I think he is more a reflection of the dead end of a lot. Like we're in a moment, and I really don't know how to articulate this more succinctly, and I apologize for it being
Sure.
very fuzzy. But we're at a moment where we need a different way of conceptualizing politics from right and left, or from liberal and conservative, and one is the party of big government, one is the party of small government. It's like this is not. It doesn't explain how we've been governed certainly for the past 25 years, but especially even more than that. And that new set of arrangements hasn't come into being now. I mean, American
it's shifting though, right? Like my generation is seeing this shift, and we're like, hold on. Like I just I interviewed. It'll come out after this interview with Liz Brown on the whole Maha movement, and like in 15 years, it totally flipped, and everybody's like, wait, how does this? This is all reconfiguring.
So now, the people who are talking about food purity and like industrial foods are bad are on the right, whereas 20 years ago they were like the Pinkos running food co-ops. And by the way, there's I think one thing that would help America be a better nation and be more comfortable with itself is to watch King of the Hill, straight through and new season out. But there's an episode where Hank Hill, who is like a very standard kind of conservative, like with a heart, middle American, and there's an episode where he joins a food co-op because he's sick of the bad meat that gets butchered at Megalomart, which is kind of like a Walmart on steroids, and everything is corporatized. So he goes to this hippie co-op because they have really good hand butchered artisanal meat. And then hilarity ensues. But like King of the Hill would solve all sorts of things. It really that's everything about America, in all sorts of different ways. But yeah, we are we're in a place where the old prayers, the old gods are dead, and they don't make sense anymore. And what has emerged that is new is not yet clear. I used to talk 20 years ago, 15 years ago, that it was less about right and left and it was more about choice versus control. I think on some level, I would like that to be the dividing line of as we move into a new era. These are the signs. Do you want to control more things, or do you want to give people more choices? And that's going to explain things. But I don't know that that's happening. But and I think a big part of it is generational. Like if you go back and you look at, after World War II, the greatest generation, like the people who were born in and raised in the Depression and fought in World War II, they had a pretty strong run where, the economy took off. They tended to be more deferential to expertise and to centralization in business, as well as other aspects of the economy, and of social life. They were more conformist. They got kind of replaced by the baby boom, which tended to be more individualistic and wanting to find its own path. And, all of these are very broad brush. The baby boom is done. Like, and I say this as part of, I'm in the second to last year of the baby boom, but like the baby boom's reign of innocence or terror, however you define it, is coming to an end. And, we're starting to see now, people on the, it's not going to be right or left. I mean, like a lot of the battles now, I think, are generational, where people who are millennials and Gen Z versus Gen X and baby boomers, they're fighting over resources, real and imagined, and opportunity. I think a lot of younger Americans, expected to be moving up more in work ladders and things like that. They expected to be further along in their lives than they are right now. And it may not be because the boomers refuse to die or refuse to retire. The economy has shifted. So we're in a, this is fascinating actually, but it's also it's very angry, it's very polarized, and there is a huge amount of smoke, but not a lot of clear pathway to what comes next. I hope that people will take more seriously these ideas of the one of the most important ways to think about stuff is do you have more choice or are you being controlled more? And when you think about that socially, when you think about that economically, when you think about that politically, it starts to open up new ways of talking about stuff. And and I think I'm stacking the deck there. I mean, libertarians are the group that wants more choice. But to go back to your larger question about the libertarian movement, there's, just as there are a lot of conservatives who, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, were all about free trade and immigration, and now are, nativists, or they want to close the borders to goods and people. You see a lot of that in the libertarian movement. I mean, that whole debate between Dave Smith and Alex Nowrasteh, whatever else you can say about it is you have, Dave Smith is a libertarian. He identifies as a libertarian. Yeah. He's part of the libertarian movement. And he was like, you know what, we gotta shut the borders. We have too many immigrants. And that is, that's the sign of a movement that has not figured out the next set of points that are a consensus of yes, this is what it means to be a libertarian.
Is that a new phenomenon? I mean, you've been around in this movement a lot longer than I have. Is that a new phenomenon, or is there always these sort of views coming in and out, and people are sort of still arguing and wrestling with, what's the right view? What's the more way to think about it?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to raise that question, and to raise it is really to answer it and say yes, but I think there were points where, Reason's motto, Reason was founded in 1968, and its motto is free minds and free markets. And to my mind, that's a pretty good working definition of what it means to be libertarian.
Yeah.
And I think of myself increasingly, less dogmatically. Here's a checklist of 10 policy positions, and you have to agree with me on all 10. And then you're a libertarian. If you disagree with me on one of them, then you are cast out, and you're awful. And it's more directional. But, are we moving in more directions of freedom at the individual level? Because it's clearly government spending, which is something that both Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives agree with. Because when they've been in power, the government just keeps growing and spending more. And that's a real issue. I think as important, though, is are you shutting down the ability of individuals to participate in society or to find their own way? That to me is a core libertarian value. And I think, it's so to a roundabout way of saying, yes, there's always been tension, and, there's never been one true form of libertarianism or conservatism or liberalism, progressivism, et cetera. But I think across the political spectrum right now, you see all of these categories are loose because people are, but nothing is settled. We're in a period of flux, and that brings with it really great opportunities, but it's also, it's anxiety inducing. It's kind of terrifying. And you're going to end up with more things where, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who started this century as an anti-vax left-wing environmental lawyer, who was clearly on the left and hated Republicans and conservatives, is now, the Secretary of Health and Human Services. J.D. Vance has said really positive things about Biden's antitrust chief, and about how we got to start policing corporations that are too big. That's not your father's or grandfather's Republican Party.
Yeah.
But there it is, right? And on the left, I think you're going to start seeing people to some degree like Jared Polis, the governor of Colorado, who is much more free market oriented. And, he's very pro-immigration and he's very pro capitalism, and then reducing business regulations. So however the parties end up, sorting themselves, start seeing new coalitions that won't make sense from the perspective of 25 years ago.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Do you have a few extra minutes? I want to get to something I know is important to you if you have a little bit more time. Yeah, okay. You've often been sort of ribbed sometimes on the Reason Roundtable about your encyclopedic knowledge of things like pop culture, and over the years I've noticed that it is probably more indicative of something important to you rather than just Nick knows knowledge, that's great and stuff, but I want to be like, man, you've got to be at least twice your age, because you know so much, and I don't know how you have time to even imbibe all of this information. What explains this?
I must have gotten an early government brain boost chip that just implanted memories, and I'm lucky that way.
Yeah.
But no, and I also, as I get older, I find myself, forgetting, things that are really important, in names and dates and things that matter. Okay. And I can remember like a Bugs Bunny, plot or something from, something that would have been made 20 or 30 years before I was born. So it's like my priorities are kind of whacked. But, part of it for me is that as I was saying earlier, I was not, I'm not political with a capital P, and I wasn't that way as a kid. Like I'm interested in, art and music and writing and film and video and like forms of creative expression. That's like what I've always been interested in. When I graduated in college I went to Rutgers in New Jersey, and I was the entertainment section editor of a newspaper and a book review editor. And because I just read a lot and watched a lot of shit and listened to a lot of music. And then I worked as a journalist at like music magazines and teen magazines. And, I like pop culture. That was all before I went to grad school. And I keep an interest in that because I feel like that's where, that's how we talk about ourselves. That's how we communicate. That's how we become who we
Expression.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, and it's not like, oh, well, we know who we are and then we seek to express it perfectly. It's like through the act of creating music or buying music or going to a concert or talking with people about music, we find out more about who we are and what we like and what kind of world we want to live in and belong in. So it's like constant, we're constantly redefining ourselves and thinking about ourselves and gaining more knowledge. And so, for me, pop culture has always been that. And I grew up never really making a distinction between high culture and low culture. And then, one of the people I worked with in my doctoral program was this character named Leslie Fiedler, who is one of the great cultural theorists or cultural studies people of post-World War II America. And he very explicitly refused to make distinctions between high and like low culture.
Well, what explains that? Why is that?
I think what he saw was that high culture is something that comes out of an earlier era in America, but also, civilization, where high culture was something that you could only imbibe in if you were educated, if you were wealthy, if you were connected to the aristocracy or the court or the right people, because, it might be in Latin. It might be, to go to certain types of performances cost a lot of money or they're invite only. And so like high culture, when people talk about, having class and having high culture and good aesthetics, a lot of the times that's just a way of separating themselves out from the masses. And what happened, in world history and certainly in American history, starting in the 19th century, but then really ramping up in the 20th century, is that things became democratized. People who had no connection suddenly became rich. And, things like the paperback book as a technology emerged, and it allowed, lower income people to read. And it was often trashy stuff, but then they kind of liked it. And then they refused to apologize for it. And everything became kind of mixed and blended and blurred in a way that's really interesting to me. So, I consume a lot of different types of culture, and I like that. And, you had asked me what in pop culture, like in some questions before him, what in pop culture has had the most lasting influence on you personally? And I was like, oh, that's a great question. And I was thinking, like for me, the Bugs Bunny cartoons, which, I grew up watching on reruns. And I don't know how I watched as much TV as I did as a kid, because I was always out, I was digging underground forts and climbing trees and playing baseball.
You were doing all the unsafe things nobody does does today.
Right. Yeah. Bike ramps, on my spider bike where my friends and I would put on football helmets and then, break our arms because we made ridiculous Evel Knievel style jumps, all of that kind of stuff. But I watched an amazing amount of TV. Most of it was in reruns, but Bugs Bunny was a really early and profound influence because Bugs Bunny first, is wisecracking, and in order to understand what he's saying or referring to, you have to learn a lot of stuff because, and especially given his cartoons are I guess from the 40s mostly, or the early ones. And who, to understand who the people are that he's making fun of, that becomes a quest, et cetera. But I like the fact that, Bugs Bunny was an instigator, a trickster figure. And that, to me, that's what pop culture is kind of about. It forces you to kind of engage the world more fully and on all sorts of different levels, high and low, comic and tragic and all of that. That to me is kind of the template, I think.
Yeah. Do you think culture has? I mean, what level of shaping do you think that pop culture? I mean, maybe you object to the idea of pop culture. I don't know, but in terms of shaping American politics and American way of looking at the world.
Yeah, it's in the 90s, and I started working at Reason in 93. One of the big issues in the 90s was the effect of popular culture on behavior, and particularly bad youth behavior. So, this was cable TV affected its rollout, where it became a national phenomenon in the late 80s and early 90s. And suddenly, you had all of these people talking about how we need to rate TV programs and we need to shield our young people from the sex and violence that was everywhere on cable TV. And it's you go back and look at it and it's there's not much sex and there's not really much violence, or it's cartoonish. But, UCLA and whole other major institutions spent a ton of time focusing on how do we categorize both the amount, and intensity of violence and sex on TV, and then how it makes people f***ed up. And it was a replay of the comic book scare and the rock scare of the 1950s. I firmly believe, and then as the internet came along, similar things, and with video games, that became a huge moral panic in the 90s. I think, having done a lot of work on that, I don't think that popular culture influences decisions, and it's the dumb version of this is Mark David Chapman, the guy who shot John Lennon, was holding a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, and he said, Catcher in the Rye instructed him to kill John Lennon because he had to get rid of phonies. And it's that's never how popular culture works. And popular culture reflects societal concerns. It gives people places where they can kind of look at different ways of living and kind of commune and think about who they are. What we live in, which is kind of amazing, and this, was unbelievable, inconceivable when I was a kid, is, that we now can produce and consume whatever we want on whatever terms we want, because the means of cultural production and consumption have been totally democratized. I mean, look at this podcast that we're doing, the podcast form, but we're on this thing called the internet, and we're using this program called StreamYard, and we're having a visual audio communication across time and space, and then it's going to go up on something where somebody in Zambia might watch it. What the hell, right? So we're living golden age.
It's pretty amazing. Yeah, I'm amazed as well. It's very remarkable.
And it's, what I think pop culture tends to reflect things more. It does, all art, everything has an effect, and you don't know what the effect is. The consumer, the audience, the individual, the reader, the watcher, is responsible for what they do with whatever they consume. But it's very complicated, and it's just that I tend to think that art, broadly speaking, expression, is a way that we participate in community. It is not. It's not like a drug that gets injected into us and then we become zombified, or we want this or that, or we act a particular way. And I think part of what we bemoan about the current world, which is that, oh my God, we're so polarized. We're in our little tribes, we're in our little camps. Like that's actually that's been the dream of of humans for their entire lives, where like you're not stuck with the tribe you're born into. You're not you don't only have three channels, and you don't only have like three identities. There's a great anthropologist named Grant McCracken who wrote a book called Plenitude in the 90s online, and then he printed a version of it, but he talked about how like what's been going on over the past 50 years is the quickening speciation of social types, and it's aided and abetted by things like we're wealthier now, but we have more access to experimenting with who we are and displaying who we are and communicating with other people. And like, to my mind, this is, and again, like if you look at mass critics of American culture right after World War II in the 50s, two things were going on. And like, they didn't try to kind of minimize the cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, they were saying there is this mass produced culture, which is dumb and stupid and lowest common denominator, and it's insulting and it dulls people, and that's terrible. And then they were looking at the blow-ups of like, of beatnik culture and of the civil rights movement and of homosexuals and women feminists, wanting to be seen. Like, oh my God, society is falling apart because now there's too much going on, and like, how can you choose? How can you pick? Like, we're still in that world, kind of.
Yeah.
And I think it would be better if we said, what is kind of amazing is that like we have an unbelievable amount of cultural freedom to live how we want. And it doesn't mean people are going to like you, and it doesn't mean taxes are going to go down, and it doesn't mean it's going to be pretty, or you're going to do it for more than a couple of years. But like, you can start your own church, you can start your own, you can start your own Burning Man, you can live, peacefully like the Unabomber without, the bombing.
Yeah,
like,
right.
Like, it's kind of amazing, and this is what I thought, like, when people would talk about what's the American dream, it's like, I thought it would be, that you'd be able to do your own thing and in a community and
in
with
peace.
People.
Yeah, do your own thing in peace. Like, people left you to do your own thing because they want to acknowledge that you have that right and you can celebrate that yourself, as well as you give it to others. Yeah.
And that it's, ultimately too, and this, I'm talking to somebody who's not in this conversation, but like, people who rank on capitalism or libertarianism often be like, oh, well, it's so individualized, and like you become atomized and alienated. And it's like, no, you're doing it with other people.
That's not a guarantee. You can choose not to be. You can be a Catholic on Sunday and a bowling league on Monday, and then, go play pinochle on Tuesday. I don't know.
Which, by the way, to bring it back to postmodernism at the risk of, completely knocking out anybody who might still be listening. But that idea of, this is the proper way to think about identity in our lives, which is that we have each of us, I think, has a sense of self, like, and we know who we are through time and space. So like, when I look at pictures of myself as a kid, I recognize myself there. I may not be able to fully access what I was thinking, but I know that's me. But, so I have a sense of self, but then we have these constant overlapping, partial, changing identities that make up who we are. And that's kind of how we move our way through the world. And it might be, I am Catholic on Sunday, and I'm in a bowling league, and I'm, playing pinochle, and a million other things. And I'm part of a film society, or, a Scrabble team, or whatever, and I'm a father and a husband and a parent.
Pluralist identity. Yeah.
Yeah. And you realize like these things all kind of stack up in different ways. Things, it's a Jenga board almost, like where, something gets pulled out. Hopefully things don't crash, but like other things get added. And like, that's very postmodern to say, like, what we have is a lot of partial overlapping systems of knowledge and of community and of identity. And when you stack them up, you get a fuller picture of who we are. But it's going to be changing as conditions change and as our desires change and as our circumstances change. And like, learning how to be comfortable with that, because it is hard. Like, sometimes, everybody wants something, that will always be true and stable and there, forever and ever. But, that's hard to find. And even in Christianity, like people's, the commitment to Christ is, can stay completely constant and undisturbed. But exactly what that means changes over time, at
Sure.
different points in your life.
Yeah, I mean, I think that relationship changes over time for every individual. It also, people come to Christ in different ways, and their experience of Christ is, obviously personalized to a large extent. So, yeah, no, that's true. Nick, I have taken more of your time than I asked for, and I really appreciate you giving us this. This has been just a fascinating conversation. It's been very enriching for me. You kind of checked an item off my bucket list by telling me I asked you a good question. So,
well, a lot of them, yeah. And I know, I've talked about this in other contexts. I've become like the one thing I'm evangelical about, and I'll because I think your audience would find it interesting, is the Par Lagervis novel Barabbas.
Yes,
which is just a phenomenal short novel that came out shortly after World War II by a Swedish writer. And it's about Barabbas after he is ransomed, by Jesus. And then he has no idea who this guy is. And he has this unearned grace, freedom, and life. And it's like, what does he do? And it is just a phenomenal novel for believers, but also for non-believers, because it was part of what is broadly called Christian existentialism, of like, well, we know we need to make sense of our lives. And it's a beautiful book that I think is just, I don't believe in required reading, but I think that might be at the top of my fictional required list.
Well, you suggested it to me back in May when we met up in New York for the Soho debate that we've been referring to, and I bought it, and it was a read that usually when I try to read books that are set in like the time of Jesus or the Apostle era or whatever, that is like a fictional account that's just trying to, capitalize on, not capitalize, but you know what I mean? Work with that material. Somehow it just was never appealing to me. And by page 3, I was like, well, this is great. Like this is really substantive and rich.
It's contemporaneous.
And it became better.
It's contemporary. Yeah. Good. Well, I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah. Well, Nick, thank you. I appreciate this time, and hopefully we'll see each other again when I'm in New York.
That would be great. Thanks so much. And best to LCI and everything you're doing.
Thanks, Nick.